December 26, 1944, deep in the forests of East Prussia, Adolf Hitler stood hunched over a map table in the Wolf's Lair, his Führerhauptquartier, his fortress, of concrete and paranoia. The room was thick with cigarette smoke and tension. Around him stood the remnants of his once mighty general staff, men who had conquered Europe, men who now avoided his eyes. Hitler's hands trembled as he stared at the blue arrows on the map. American arrows, cutting through his carefully planned offensive, like a hot knife through butter. His voice started low, almost a whisper. Then it rose, building, spiraling, until he was screaming, fists pounding the wooden table, spittle flying from his lips. The target of his rage was not the weather, not the fuel shortages, not even the Allied air superiority that had decimated his supply lines. It was one man, George S. Patton, just 72 hours earlier. Patton's Third Army had been 100 miles to the south, facing east, engaged in a completely different battle. Every military expert, every logistics officer, every German intelligence assessment said it would take this army 2 weeks minimum to disengage, turn 90 degrees, and march north through freezing conditions. Patton did it in 3 days, and in doing so, he shattered Hitler's last desperate gamble, the Ardennes offensive, Operation Whacked am Rhein. The battle that history would call the Bulge, what Hitler screamed that December morning, has been recorded by witnesses, fragments preserved in diaries and post-war testimonies, words that revealed not just fury, but something far more significant, fear. This is what Hitler said, and why it changed everything. To understand why Patton's march was considered impossible, you first need to understand what impossible actually looked like in December 1944. Let me paint the picture. The Western Front had stalled after the breakout from Normandy, after the liberation of Paris, after that heady rush across France. When victory seemed just weeks away, the Allied advance had ground to a halt at the German border. The reasons were simple: supply lines stretched thin, fuel running dangerously low, the port of Antwerp still not fully operational, soldiers exhausted after 6 months of continuous combat, and the Germans had retreated to their prepared defensive positions. The vaunted Siegfried Line. Suddenly, those easy victories felt like distant memories. On December 16, 1944, Hitler launched his counteroffensive. 200,000 German soldiers, over 1,000 tanks, nearly 2,000 artillery pieces, all concentrated in the Ardennes forest, the same route the Wehrmacht had used to conquer France in 1940, a calculated gamble, Hitler's last throw of the dice. The target was the port of Antwerp. Split the Allied armies in two, force a negotiated peace, buy time for his miracle weapons. The attack achieved complete surprise. American intelligence had failed catastrophically. The thinly held American line crumbled. Entire divisions were surrounded and destroyed. The 106th Infantry Division, 8,000 men, captured in one of the worst American defeats of the war. Within 3 days, the Germans had punched a bulge 50 miles deep into Allied lines. Hence the name, the Battle of the Bulge. Now, here is where geography matters. General George Patton and his Third Army were positioned 100 miles to the south, near the city of Metz. They were facing east, attacking toward the Saar industrial region, engaged in their own offensive, making progress. Between Patton and the crisis in the Ardennes lay 100 miles of frozen roads, snow-covered mountain passes, icy river crossings, and the brutal arithmetic of logistics. Moving an army is not like moving a car. You cannot simply turn the wheel and go in a different direction. Consider the numbers. The Third Army consisted of over 250,000 men, more than 100,000 vehicles, tanks, half-tracks, trucks, jeeps, artillery pieces, ambulances, fuel trucks, ammunition carriers. Each division required over 1,000 tons of supplies per day just to fight. Moving this mass of men and machinery requires intricate coordination. Units must disengage from combat without being destroyed. Supply lines must be redirected. fuel depots repositioned, ammunition stockpiled at new locations, communication networks reestablished, traffic control planned for roads never designed for such volume. According to standard Army logistics doctrine of 1944, such a reorientation would require 3 to 4 weeks of preparation, minimum. German intelligence agreed. When Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt planned the Ardennes offensive, he calculated that the Americans would need at least 2 weeks to mount a serious counterattack from the south. His staff considered even that estimate optimistic. This was not mere arrogance. This was math, cold, logical, military mathematics. And this is why every general in that room at the Verdun conference on December 19th would react with disbelief when Patton told them what he planned to do. Here is something most people do not know about George S. Patton. He saw it coming. While American intelligence was dismissing the German buildup in the Ardennes as defensive, Patton was suspicious. His own intelligence officer, Colonel Oscar Koch, had been tracking German movements. The picture worried him. Too many divisions repositioning, too much rail traffic, something was brewing. On December 12th, 4 days before the German attack, Patton made a decision that would prove decisive. He ordered his staff to begin contingency planning, 3 separate plans, code-named by the operations staff for the directions Third Army might need to move. Plan A if the Germans attacked toward the north, Plan B if they struck northwest, Plan C if they drove due west toward the Meuse River. His staff thought he was being paranoid. They were already planning offensive operations toward the Saar. Why waste time? Hypotheticals, Patton insisted. Get it done, work out the details. Unit movements, supply routes, traffic plans, everything they did on December 16th. When news of the German breakthrough reached 3rd Army headquarters, Patton was eating dinner. His aide delivered the message. Patton read it, set down his fork, and smiled. Then he called his staff together. We are going north, he told them. Activate the contingency plans. I want to attack. By December 22nd, 6 days. To completely reverse an army of 250,000 men, to disengage from active combat, to wheel 90 degrees, to march 100 miles, and to launch a coordinated offensive against the southern flank of the German breakthrough. His staff stared at him. Sir, his G4 logistics officer said, the roads are iced over. We have units scattered across 50 miles. We would need to stockpile fuel, ammunition, rations. Patton interrupted. Then you better get started. December 19, 1944. The French town of Verdun. Supreme Allied Commander General Dwight Eisenhower convened an emergency conference. The situation was grim. The Allied commanders gathered around the table looked exhausted, frightened. Some were openly discussing retreat, perhaps pull back to the Meuse River, establish a defensive line, regroup. Eisenhower opened the meeting with words that surprised them. The present situation is to be regarded as one of opportunity for us and not of disaster. There will be only cheerful faces at this conference table. Patton responded first. Hell, let's have the guts to let the sons of bitches go all the way to Paris. Then we'll really cut 'em up and chew 'em up. The room went silent. Eisenhower turned to him. George, I want you to go to Luxembourg and take charge of the battle on the southern flank. When can you attack? Without hesitation. December 22nd. With 3 divisions, you are probably wondering how the room reacted, stunned silence, then muttering. General Omar Bradley shook his head. British staff officers exchanged glances. This was preposterous, lunacy. Third Army was 100 miles away, facing the wrong direction, engaged in combat. General Bedell Smith, Eisenhower's chief of staff, actually laughed. Don't be fatuous, George. Patton did not flinch. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a piece of paper. The contingency plans, already drafted, already distributed to his division commanders, waiting only for a code word. I have 3 plans, Patton explained. I left my chief of staff standing by to receive one of 3 code words, depending on which direction I am ordered to take. He will implement the corresponding plan. The room fell silent again, but this time It was a different kind of silence. Eisenhower looked at Bradley. Bradley looked at Patton. Something passed between them. An understanding. "All right, George," Eisenhower said. "You got it." At 4:30 p.m., Patton left the conference room. He walked to a telephone, picked up the receiver. He spoke one word, nickel, the code word for a 90-degree turn to the north. Destination, the surrounded town of Bastogne. Within hours, 250,000 men were in motion. December 20th, 1944. 0300 hours, across the frozen landscape of eastern France. A military machine began to stir. In the darkness, truck engines coughed to life. Tank commanders pulled maps from waterproof cases. Division headquarters transmitted movement orders through crackling field radios. Let us be clear about what was happening. The 4th Armored Division had been attacking eastward toward the Saar. Now they had to disengage. In the middle of combat, pull back without the Germans realizing it. Wheel north. And begin a 100-mile forced march through freezing weather. The 80th Infantry Division. Same situation. The 26th Infantry Division. Same. All of this happening simultaneously, on icy roads, in the dead of winter, at night. You are probably wondering how this was even possible. The answer is not strategy. The answer is not superior equipment. The answer is preparation, and the grinding, unglamorous work of logistics. Let me take you inside the machine. Traffic control. The 3rd Army Operations Staff had mapped every road, every intersection, every bridge between their current positions and Bastogne. They assigned military police to each critical junction. These MPs stood in the freezing cold hour after hour, directing traffic, keeping the columns moving, preventing the jams that could paralyze an entire army. Fuel. Patton's quartermaster had established emergency fuel dumps along the projected route. Trucks carrying jerry cans of precious gasoline leapfrogged the advancing columns. When tanks ran low, fuel trucks were waiting. No delays, ammunition, same principle, stockpiles pre-positioned, trucks following the combat units, ready to resupply after each engagement. Food, the Red Ball Express, that legendary convoy system that had sustained the Allied advance, now redirected north. Hot coffee and rations for soldiers who had not slept in days. December 21st. 1944. Dawn. The movement continued, through snowstorms, through temperatures that dropped to 5 below zero, through roads so icy that tanks slid into ditches and had to be recovered by maintenance crews working with frozen fingers. Combat Command B of the 4th Armored Division, under Brigadier General Holmes Dager, they covered over 70 miles in 24 hours, on icy roads, in constant contact with retreating German units. Here is a detail. That tells you everything about Patton's army. The chaplain of the 3rd Army was Monsignor James O'Neill. In the days before the attack, Patton had called him in. The weather was terrible, fog, snow, freezing rain, no air support possible. Patton gave him an unusual order: write me a prayer for good weather. O'Neill did. 250,000 copies were printed and distributed to every soldier in 3rd Army. On one side, a prayer asking the Almighty for favorable weather for battle. On the other, a Christmas greeting from Patton himself, whether divine intervention or coincidence. On December 23rd, the skies cleared. Allied aircraft thundered overhead for the first time in days. P-47 Thunderbolt strafed German columns. C-47 transports dropped desperately needed supplies to the surrounded paratroopers in Bastogne, but in Bastogne itself, the situation was desperate. The 101st Airborne Division, surrounded, cut off. Running low on ammunition, medical supplies nearly exhausted, wounded soldiers freezing in aid stations. On December 22nd, the Germans had sent a delegation under flag of truce. They delivered an ultimatum: surrender or face total annihilation. The acting division commander, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, gave his famous one-word response: nuts. The Germans were confused. They asked for clarification. One of McAuliffe's officers explained, it means the same thing. As go to hell, the siege continued, but now the men in Bastogne could hear something in the distance, artillery to the south. Getting closer, Patton was coming December 24th, Christmas Eve, 1944. Combat Command R of the 4th Armored Division was now within striking distance of Bastogne, but the Germans had reinforced. The village of Chaumont blocked the path, fierce fighting all day. American tanks and German anti-tank guns dueling in the snow. By nightfall, breakthrough had not come. Patton paced his headquarters, restless, impatient. His men were dying. The paratroopers in Bastogne were dying. Every hour mattered. He called his division commanders. Push harder, no rest, no sleep. Breakthrough. December 25th, Christmas Day. The men of the 4th Armored ate cold rations in their vehicles. No Christmas dinner, no warmth, just the rumble of engines and the crack of artillery. General Hugh Gaffey, commanding the 4th Armored, reorganized his forces. He shifted his axis of attack. Instead of pushing straight north toward the obvious approach, he swung toward the village of Assenois, a smaller village, less defended. A gamble. He called in Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams. Later, this man would become famous as the general who commanded U.S. forces in Vietnam. The tank that bears his name, the M1 Abrams, is still the main battle tank of the United States Army. But on that Christmas Day in 1944, Abrams was simply a tough, aggressive tank commander with a reputation for pushing forward when others hesitated. Gaffey gave him his orders. You're breaking through today. Take your combat command and punch a hole to Bastogne. Abrams nodded. His column moved out, tanks in the lead, infantry following in half tracks, artillery ready to fire. They hit Assenois at 4:30 p.m. The fighting was brief and brutal. German defenders overwhelmed by the sudden fury of the American attack. December 26, 1944, 4:50 p.m. Captain William Dwight's tank was the first American vehicle to reach the perimeter of Bastogne. He linked up with soldiers of the 326th Airborne Engineer Battalion. The siege was broken. Within hours, trucks loaded with ammunition, medical supplies, and food rolled into the battered town. Wounded soldiers were evacuated. Reinforcements poured in. Patton had done what everyone said was impossible. 100 miles, 90-degree turn, 72 hours. Let us talk numbers, because the numbers tell the story better than any rhetoric. 3rd Army, December 19th to December 26th, 1 week, total distance covered by lead elements, 133 miles, divisions reoriented, 6. Combat divisions committed to attack, 3 increased to 6 within days, prisoners captured, over 12,000, German tanks destroyed, 144 confirmed. American casualties during the relief operation, approximately 3,500 killed, wounded, and missing. German casualties in 3rd Army sector, estimated at over 20,000. Now, consider the context. Standard military doctrine, then and now, states that reorienting a corps-sized formation requires a minimum of 5 to 7 days of planning, moving that formation over 100 miles on a single axis of advance, another 5 to 7 days. Launching an offensive, additional days for reconnaissance, positioning, and coordination. By the book, Patton should have arrived at Bastogne no earlier than January 5th. At the earliest, he arrived on December 26th. The German generals understood what this meant. Field Marshal von Rundstedt had planned his offensive based on certain assumptions about Allied reaction times. Those assumptions were shattered completely. His timetables were useless. General Hasso von Manteuffel, commanding the 5th Panzer Army striking toward Bastogne, later admitted in his post-war memoirs that the speed of Patton's response caught the German high command completely off guard. We knew Patton was good, Manteuffel wrote. We did not know he was this good, but the most significant reaction came from the Wolf's Lair. December 26, 1944, late evening, the Wolf's Lair, Rastenburg, East Prussia. Hitler's military headquarters since 1941. a compound of bunkers and barracks hidden in the forests, surrounded by minefields, patrolled by SS guards, the nerve center of the crumbling German war machine. Hitler had been following the Ardennes offensive obsessively, hour by hour, each report analyzed, each map update scrutinized. This was his battle, his conception, his gamble. The early reports had been promising. The breakthrough at the Schnee Eifel, the encirclement of American units, the advance toward the Meuse. Hitler had allowed himself to hope, but then, Bastogne, that stubborn town at the crossroads, 7 roads converging there, essential for the German advance, and it would not fall. The American paratroopers clung to it like terriers, and now Patton had broken through. General Alfred Jodl, chief of operations, delivered the report. Bastogne relieved. American armored units pushing in. German forces around the town now fighting on 2 fronts. What followed has been described by multiple witnesses. Their accounts, collected after the war by Allied interrogators and preserved in archives, tell a consistent story. Hitler exploded. His face went purple. His hands shook violently. He swept maps from the table, overturned chairs, raged at his generals, at fate, at the Americans. According to testimony given by General Heinz Guderian, chief of the Army General Staff, Hitler screamed that this was impossible, that the Americans could not have moved this quickly, that someone had betrayed the plans, that there must be a traitor. It is not the Americans, Jodl apparently replied. It is Patton. He was prepared. This only made Hitler angrier. That cowboy, Hitler reportedly shouted. That theatrical fool with his pearl-handled revolvers and his fantasies of glory. How dare he? How dare he? But then, according to Guderian, something strange happened. Hitler's rage subsided. He became quiet, almost contemplative. He turned to his generals and said something that shocked them. According to Guderian's post-war memoir Panzer Leader, Hitler said words to this effect. Patton is the only Allied general I fear. The others are cautious, predictable, but Patton, he is unpredictable. He attacks when he should defend. He advances when he should retreat. He does what cannot be done. Now, a note on sources. We must be careful here. Guderian's memoirs were written after the war. Memory is fallible. Self-interest colors recollection. The exact wording may not be precisely what Hitler said, but the substance is corroborated by other accounts, by the testimony of other officers present, by the documented pattern of German intelligence assessments that specifically tracked Patton's movements and warned of his aggressiveness. The German High Command feared George Patton, not because he was the best strategist, not because he commanded the most resources, but because he was fast, ruthless, and utterly indifferent to what the rulebook said was possible. And on that December night in 1944, Hitler understood that his last great gamble had failed, not because of Allied numbers, not because of Allied air power, but because one American general had moved faster than anyone believed possible. The Ardennes offensive would continue for several more weeks. More men would die. More battles would be fought, but the strategic verdict was already in. Hitler had rolled the dice. Patton had called his bluff. So why does this matter, beyond the history, beyond the drama? Why does the relief of Bastogne still resonate 80 years later? 3 reasons. First, it proved that the impossible is sometimes just the untried. Every logistics manual, every staff college teaching, every experienced officer in that room at Verdun, they all agreed. What Patton proposed could not be done. The math did not work. The timetables were clear, but Patton had done something the others had not. He had prepared for the unexpected. Those contingency plans, drafted before the crisis, ready to execute at a single code word. They made the impossible possible. This lesson is now taught at every military academy in the world. Preparation is not about anticipating the expected. It is about being ready for the unexpected. Patton's staff complained about drafting plans for hypothetical scenarios. Those hypothetical plans saved the war. Second, it demonstrated that speed is a weapon, modern military doctrine. particularly the American doctrine of rapid deployment and maneuver warfare, can trace its lineage directly to what Patton did in December 1944, the Gulf War of 1991, the famous left hook that destroyed the Iraqi army in 100 hours. The generals who planned that operation studied Patton's Bastogne relief as a model: speed, surprise, overwhelming force at the decisive point. But there is something most people do not know: the human cost of Patton's speed. Those men driving tanks through blizzards, infantry sleeping in frozen foxholes, mechanics working on engines with bare hands because gloves made the work impossible, medics amputating frostbitten limbs in field hospitals. They paid the price for speed. In the week of the Bastogne relief, Third Army suffered over 10,000 casualties. Killed, wounded, missing, frostbite cases overwhelming the medical system. Patton knew this. He wrote in his diary that war is simple, direct, and ruthless, but he also visited hospitals, walked among the wounded, understood what he was asking of his men. The third reason this matters is perhaps the most important. It changed the psychology of the war. After 6 months of grinding combat, after the stall at the German border, after the shock of the Ardennes offensive, Allied morale was fragile. There were whispers that the Germans were unbeatable, that the war would drag on for years, that perhaps a negotiated peace was the answer. Bastogne changed that. The image of American tanks rolling into that besieged town, the relief on the faces of those exhausted paratroopers, the knowledge that when things seemed darkest, the cavalry had come. This was not just a military victory. It was a psychological turning point. The Germans, too, understood. After Bastogne, the Wehrmacht never launched another major offensive in the West. They fell back, defended, delayed, but they had lost the initiative. And in the Wolf's Lair, Hitler retreated further into fantasy, raging about wonder weapons and divine intervention. The reality of Bastogne was too painful to face. The man who had built an empire on speed and audacity had been out-Odysseyed by an American general with pearl-handled revolvers and a foul mouth and a genius for the art of war. There is a final human element worth remembering. Patton never received a 5th star, never became a 5-star general like Eisenhower and Bradley and MacArthur. His controversial statements, his slapping of soldiers, his lack of diplomatic skill, all of it weighed against him. But when military professionals discuss the great commanders of World War II, when they analyze the art of maneuver warfare, when they study what is possible when preparation meets opportunity, they talk about Bastogne, they talk about 72 hours, they talk about George S. Patton, December 1944, 100 miles, 90 degrees, 72 hours, 250,000 men, frozen roads, impossible odds, and one general who refused to accept that impossible meant anything at all. What Hitler screamed at his generals that night was more than frustration. It was the sound of a man who finally understood that he had met his match, not in resources, not in numbers, but in sheer, relentless audacity. Patton's relief of Bastogne remains one of the greatest feats of military logistics in history, studied at West Point, at Sandhurst, at every military academy that teaches the art of war. The next time someone tells you something cannot be done, remember Bastogne, remember December, remember Patton. If you want to hear another impossible story from World War II, check out our next video. How one man's 30-second decision at D-Day saved the entire invasion. Subscribe so you do not miss it. Hit the bell icon for notifications. And share this video with someone who appreciates real history. Thanks for watching.